The collection began as like an attempt to write a novel. I think I don't know if that happens with a lot of short story writers. You start out wanting to write a novel, but the form is so big and overwhelming that you sort of end up writing shorter form as a result of the bigness of the project. So the first story that I wrote in this collection was a penny short, but that was a novel. That was actually like a 100-page novel manuscript that wasn't going anywhere. And so when I trashed it, I ended up picking like that one story just stuck with me. It was like the one thing that I just loved and I didn't want to let go of. So I started, just trying to shorten it, give it its own little arc, and then submitting it as its own like standalone piece. And that ended up being the first story to get published in this collection. The first story that sort of became like an anchor point for the rest of the stories, with at least thematically. And that character in that story became another protagonist in another earlier story from the brush, Frantic Rustling. So that's the same character, and that's the beginning point of it anyway.
Was that the point? Was that the point at which you thought to yourself, like, oh, okay, like I'm writing stories, or was that like a one-off, and then you were like, oh, I'm gonna, this will be a one-off, and I'm gonna go try my novel again now?
It was always the idea to write a novel. So that's what I was always thinking. And but along the way, though, I kept writing stories, and I was taking classes at UCLA Extension. The short story classes just seemed easier to workshop in, because I took a novel writing class too, but it just was it's just hard to get traction, because you're just reading like a chapter here and there of everybody's work. People are reading a chapter here and there of your work. So the whole process of learning how to write like short form fiction was just a lot stronger for me, at least in any formal setting. So I just kept writing stories along the way, and then more and more stories started to get published. They were starting to fit thematically together, and that's how short story collections became more my early forte as a writer. I still haven't finished a publishable novel yet, so I'm still working on that.
Do you feel like the process of learning how to write short fiction has maybe improved your chops for the novel? Because I think there is something to be gained from learning the compression, learning how to get in and out of a story, and to write in the short form that can carry over to the writing of a novel. There are lessons learned, are there not?
There must be, I think. Just in terms of like working on, well, one of the things is working on individual protagonist story arcs. Like I think in a short form, you really boil that down very tightly. So there's like one character with one thing to do, and then one thing happens. So you really you strip everything else away and you get to that. So that's been helpful. I'm not necessarily like a plot-driven reader or writer, so learning that helped a lot. I think one thing I've noticed, I think like short stories make for better movies, because they're just a much cleaner arc. Usually, they're much easier to capture in a visual medium, at least and especially in a one or 2 hour time frame. I think the thing I struggled.
Wait. I got to stop you. I want to stop you, because that's interesting to hear. It's interesting to hear you say that, because I had that very thought, especially when I was reading Korean Jesus. I told you before we came on, I felt like Korean Jesus and Astronauts were really powerful stories for me as a reader. Both of them cinematic. Both of them maybe more plot-driven in a traditional sense than some of the other stories, which are more character studies or something. But I thought to myself, like, wow, I would love to see Korean Jesus made into a film, like expanded on. Is that something you've thought about?
I've definitely thought about stuff like that a lot. So one of the things that happened when I started out trying to write fiction was I was looking for other writers in LA to just share work with. I didn't even really know the concept of workshopping at the time. And it was like I didn't know any fiction writers at all. And I know there's like thousands of fiction writers in LA now, but at the time, everybody that I ran into that was a writer was working on a screenplay. So those were the early workshops I was in. So a lot of the feedback I got was about plot was one thing, and also about staging, which I didn't think about much as a fiction writer. I think a lot of the complaints were my stories read like talking heads, just like two disembodied heads having a conversation. So a lot of stuff that I learned early on with these more visually driven writers was like, where is stuff happening? Where are people in relationship to each other in the setting? What is the action? What is the movement? So maybe that's why some of those stories come out more cinematically.
I think there's something to be gained from that kind of cross-pollination. I've always been a fan. Like, I think that was I have complicated feelings about my graduate school experience, but one of the things that I did take from it that I liked quite a bit was its emphasis, and I went to USC, its emphasis on cross-pollination. Like, you had to, in order to get the degree, study screenwriting and comedy writing and nonfiction, and like you did it all basically. And I think there's something to be gained. I think especially for writers of literary fiction, it doesn't hurt to spend time in the company of commercial screenwriters or to read books like Save the Cat or whatever, and to learn the mechanics of story structure in a really defined way. Like, that can only serve you, even if you don't use it in a one-for-one sense.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree with that. And especially, growing up in LA, living in LA now, it's just like we have so many resources in these other fields, like TV and film, but also music. Save the Cat is actually like one of my templates that I use. I don't follow it at all in terms of like I don't set out to write on those beats, but like every story I write, I take that template and just kind of put it next to it, just to see like, okay, does my story have some kind of arc? And it never lines up exactly, but it just gives me a sense of there's something traditionally 3-act going on in my story where I can see, okay, this is like what a typical human might expect to see in a story. And it doesn't work out perfectly, but it gives me a hint if something's not working.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, like, if nothing else, books like that make you have to confront the fact that as human beings, we are hardwired to some degree to expect certain things from our fictions, whether they be movies, television shows, or books, whether it's fiction or non. And I don't know about you, but for me, as a literary fiction writer, I can sometimes lose sight of that. It just helps me get back into like a more service-oriented mindset. Like, what is the reader experiencing here? As opposed to like, what do I want to work out psychologically on the page or whatever,
Yeah, I think there's a lot of usefulness to it, because I think if it's just up to me, I'm just writing about things that I like to imagine, feelings I like to investigate. I'm not particularly interested in like a plot-driven story, but I understand that that's a basic. Well, at least I kind of believe that that's a basic human expectation in story. I've read these books about the psychology of storytelling and how like early man used stories as like information gathering or like how-to manuals, basically. Like how to deal with novel situations. And so that's maybe there's something to that buried in our psyches is some expectation that we're going to possibly learn something by paying attention. And that's why there's some drive to pay attention to storytelling. May or may not be true, but it's close enough.
No, I'm fully ready to believe that. Like the ancestral, like deep biology of storytelling, it might be worth thinking about, but I also want to talk to you when while we're on the subject of like the origin story of your collection, about the process of assembling a story collection, because, we as readers get the finished product when we read short story collections. And as a writer, it seems likely that there are stories that don't make the cut. It's sort of like an album, right? Like not every song that you record in the studio makes it onto the record, or they're B-sides or something. But
right.
There is the issue of what to put in and what to leave out. And you can just, you can correct me if this is not the case for your book. But then there's also the issue of sequencing, which I think matters greatly to the success or failure of a story collection on the page, but which doesn't maybe get talked about as often as it should. Sequencing really matters, no?
But this is actually kind of an interesting story to me anyway. This collection, I've been writing it since probably the first story I think I published in 2015. So I've been writing it for a little while, but at least writing the stories that are in it for a little while. And when I first started submitting it as a book, it was not working very well. And I think I didn't know why it wasn't working. I was sending it out. I would just basically pick like my 10 to 15 favorite stories and put them all together and sent it out. And there wasn't really any interest, like barely any even like, like we like this, but it just doesn't work for us right now kind of stuff. And I wasn't sure what was wrong with it. And so I started taking it apart, and then I started looking at other story collections that I felt were very successful. And I think a lot of times those are things that are marketed sort of as collections / novels or novels and stories, like Olive Kitteridge or Visit from the Goon Squad. One collection that really is short stories that I just totally love, and almost like it's one of those books I wish I could have written if I could. Otessa Moshfegh's Homesick for Another World. And so I was looking at what makes these stories work, right? Or these books work. And that's when I realized, that's when I started thinking about stuff like thematically, things have to fit. Also like how stories move from one story to the other has to fit. It's like when someone's reading something straight through, it can't, one thing I was noticing, it doesn't work if it's confusing, with like one story to the next. Is this the same protagonist? Are we in the same story or same timeline? So there has to be some like either connectivity if they are connected, or some like discernibility if they're not connected. So things like that really went into my mind. And so I started taking the collection apart, and I took out like all of my very experimental stories. So I had written like a bunch of kind of experimental, almost prose poetry-esque kind of stuff, and I took all those out, sent that out separately as a chapbook, and that actually got picked up first. Just because, I don't know, just maybe because it's just more weird and unusual. So that came out as a little chapbook. And then
What's that called?
That's called There Is a Man. It came out on Tolsun in 2021, so a couple of years ago now. And so that was really fun. It was just like, it was like these stories, there was no pressure at all. It was the middle of the pandemic. Like, there was no events at all with it, maybe like a couple of online things, but it just came out. And, I could tell people about it, but there was no sense that I had to do anything with it. So that was like an easy, soft way to get into publishing.
Right. Right.
Yeah, totally. But then this current book though still wasn't quite working. I was still sending it out, and it was still like not getting any interest. I decided pretty early on I was going to send it to like small presses and university presses and contests and stuff. I didn't think it was quite. I just didn't feel like I could go the route of like querying agents and then sending it to big publishers. And then the agents that I had contacted, even if they liked me when they found out I had a short story collection, they were not interested anyway. So I just figured I'd just go this route. And this seems like the path that'll probably work out best for me. And this is getting to be a long story. I don't know how.
No, it's good though. It's good. I think it's useful to people who are probably who might be in a similar situation.
Yeah.
Because I think, especially in apprenticeship years or whatever you want to call them, so many writers do work in the short form, and you sort of amass a pile of stories. But I think the salient point is that that's not enough.
Yeah.
to make a collection cohere and to make it feel like a satisfying total experience for the reader. So I'm interested in hearing you talk more about getting there. Like, it came down to what? Sequencing? It came down to recognizing that there were recurring characters in this book, because there are, and how to handle that.
Yeah, no, it came down to all those things for sure. And one of the things was the sequencing was kind of hard for me to nail down. And there's another local author, C.L. Jew. She had written a book called Cake Time, like a few years back. You know C.L. And she had her book was also published by Red Hen. And her book is a novel in stories. But it's one protagonist all the way through. And it starts, I believe, with the protagonist as a teenager, and it kind of moves through her journey through adulthood, and then I think middle age is somewhere where it ends. And it just seemed like it's so readable, in that format, and it's like a very simple solution. Like if you just follow the protagonist chronologically, like everybody gets that. Nobody's confused by that. I didn't have a single protagonist. This character Reggie comes back a lot, especially in the second half, but he's not in every story. But I thought, well, it doesn't really matter. I can just chronologically format this with the protagonists of each story. So that's what I landed on. And it really, like, when I started reading it that way, it really felt like something that was not just readable, but actually kind of like fun and entertaining even to follow, like, even though they're different characters, like follow different protagonists that chronologically age from story to story. So the first story, Pluto, has the youngest character.
Sometimes that's enough. Yeah, that's enough for a reader, even if it's like an intuitive sense of narrative momentum along a timeline. It makes the read so much more satisfying. It feels like you're getting somewhere from A to Z, as opposed to kind of jumping back and forth. It's like, I guess the point is that these solutions are sometimes like really common sense and simple, and they make such a big difference. And if you're looking for a way to structure a book, like maybe try chronologically. See
exactly.
Yep. Why do we torture ourselves?
Yeah. You don't have to get that fancy all the time. And I think a lot of times us literary writers, there's a lot of complicated stuff going on already, just like the way we write and maybe even the way we think. And a few simple things to like lay the path for the reader, it makes a big difference. Because to me, it's easy to read my stories because I know them really well. But if you're encountering them for the first time, maybe it's like it could get a little hard to follow sometimes, and the stories aren't exactly like you're saying. Some of them are character studies, more than plotted stories. So there's something like a little bit of handholding or a little bit of something to just some kind of like anchor to something you don't have to worry about as you read something that has a lot of things to think about can be helpful. I learned that the hard way.
I think that these stories function so well as investigations into or explorations of people who might be living on the margins, or people who are part of the Asian diaspora and who are trying to find their way in this country with greater and lesser degrees of success. But also, I think more broadly speaking, just telling the kinds of stories that don't often enough get told. That's what I really appreciated about this. It's like, oh, these are the kinds of lives that I haven't necessarily seen enough of in the culture, in fiction, or in movie and television storytelling. Was that part of the ambition for you? Like, was that an expressed like goal of yours, as you were kind of formulating these stories, or is it something that you didn't necessarily define to yourself? And you know what I'm saying? Like, how much of it was conscious?
I think at some points is very conscious. As a Asian American writer in literary fiction, there's been a lot of really great stories told about the immigrant experience. That's been like one of our go-to subjects, and I love those stories. Those were like what gave Asian American fiction a kind of a foothold, and then it grew from there. And it's still a very like rich subject to mine for storytelling. But it's not necessarily like the story that I gravitate towards as a writer. So I'm not, I am an immigrant, but I immigrated when I was a baby. And I, even just being an Asian person in America, you have a lot of experience of otherness that's not related to being an immigrant necessarily. So in some ways, I from time, like a lot of times, I'll admit, I purposefully tried not to tell immigrant stories, even though I am an immigrant. My parents are immigrants. I grew up around a lot of immigrants.
Taiwan?
From Taiwan, yeah, exactly. From Taiwan in 72. So I immigrated in 72. But I think there's a lot of experience around, being Asian in America that's not necessarily directly like that specific narrative. And of course, it's going to be like at least tangential to a lot of my stories. Like a lot of my characters are either immigrants or immigration has affected their lives in some ways. But I didn't centralize it. And that was a conscious decision on my part. I didn't centralize that as the main narrative of my stories. And it's nothing, again, like those are the stories that sort of like set sail for the Asian American literary storytelling, right? Like when Amy Tan wrote Joy Luck Club, or when that came out, it like opened up the floodgates for Asian American fiction.
Well, that makes it clearer for me, because you think about these stories, like so many of the lives that you're depicting in these stories are affected in some way by the immigration experience, but it feels at a remove, and so you're capturing people who are existing in the aftermath of it, which is like a new space to explore, right?
That's a great way to describe it, because I've actually in my description of this collection myself have called it like post-apocalyptic in some sense, emotionally or relationally post-apocalyptic, and actually in some ways immigration is like an apocalypse. It's the end of one world and the setting off into another one, right? Like after the end. So I feel like my stories are about what's the after part, not necessarily the during part. And
right. Well, and it's interesting too, because, especially maybe for Americans, because this country, everybody's an immigrant here except for indigenous people, if you go back far enough. And I'm always fascinated by how relatively quickly, from a generational sense, people and families can assimilate. Like, I think my great-grandfather came over on my dad's side from Sicily, and my great-grandmother. And so my grandfather was first generation, my dad was second generation, I'm third generation. I feel, you know what I'm saying? Like it's pretty, I don't feel any, like, I have some affinity for Italy and, but it's not like I lived the experience of my great-grandfather who didn't speak a word of English and came over on a boat, like impoverished and the whole thing. And like, I think that the lives of the people, you talk about it as an apocalypse, which is a great way to think about it. The lives of the people who actually make the move, man, that's got to be intense. Like that's got to be a really radical experience to leave everything and come to a place where like maybe you don't speak a word of English and you just have to figure it out.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And you have no resources. You have no no built-in, no expectation of a support system. You have to find it or create it yourself. So, and I think it's really interesting, the thing you're talking about, how compressed the time frame is in America. Like this country's been around for like 250 years, and it's like things happen so fast, and we kind of lose sight of like, wow, it wasn't that long ago that this country was totally different, and it's still shifting really fast. And in terms of like nationally, that's a big deal. But like the thing you're talking about in terms of just individual families, that's like a huge shift from 3 generations. The experience can be completely different. Like somebody can go from being like basically considered like a non-American to being indistinguishable from any other American in 3 generations. That's kind of amazing.
Well, listen, I read, this is part of the history that fascinates me, because this is a perfect example of it, is the Sicilians, the Italians who showed up. My family's roots are in Louisiana. I don't know how you go from Sicily to Louisiana, but that's where they went. And Italians were considered less than.
Yeah.
They were discriminated against heavily. I think there was even in like New Orleanian history some kind of like massacre or race riot relative to Italians. I felt none of that. And I mean, I'm a big blend, so I'm not just Italian, but that was a surprise to me, is the point, reading about it all these years later and, realizing, oh shit, also Catholic, like John F. Kennedy was the first Catholic president. That used to be like a big stopper for people. So things change, and hopefully for the better. But I think you're right, though. The compressed way that it happens in a broad sense is something that I guess is encouraging. Maybe it's nice to think. It's nice to think about it. It's nice to think about it and go, oh, this is happening relatively fast in a universal sense. So even if things are super shitty right now, maybe things will be better in 100 years in a really dramatic way.
I mean, I think of it in both ways. Like, it could go either way. Like, how quickly things can improve is amazing, or change progressively. But like we've seen, things could change really quickly in the other direction too. So that's sort of like the world we're in now, where, well, I guess America's at the forefront of it, but the whole planet is like this now, where things can change extremely quickly in any direction. And so there's optimism in there, but there's also some fear.
Well, but this also feels like something that your stories are imbued with, and I guess it would be impossible for them not to. Maybe all of our stories are imbued with this, like this pressurized environment that we live in now, where things feel like they could tip one way or the other, and there's a real existential air to the times that we're living in. I think I feel an undercurrent of that in all of these stories and all of these lives. I don't know. Maybe that was more intuitive than explicit, or was it explicit?
I think it's definitely like part of my worldview, and so it'd probably be in every story in some way that things can change very quickly, and something small can happen and really shift something, not even necessarily, but something can happen and change the trajectory of your life forever. And it could be something that either came into your life, or it can be a decision you made. But that's sort of how I think you're right. A lot of writers probably do see that, and it might be something that comes up a lot in short stories, where maybe the idea is we try to get to the one thing that happens that changes that person's life forever, and that's maybe some people's definition of a short story. I took that to heart, and I feel like, that's what makes short stories work. Like, the one thing happens and everything's different afterwards. So
some of the stories, or a lot of these stories, are, as I said earlier, depicting lives like out on the margins, or depicting lives that we don't see often enough in our fictions. And I want to have you read from one of the stories in particular. I think it's called Astronauts. And if you could just set this up, just give listeners kind of an overview of what this story is about, and then we can get into the excerpt, and we'll talk about it from there.
Sure. Yeah, Astronauts is actually an immigration story, the most overt immigration story in the book. There's a character, Chinese American. The protagonist is a Chinese American guy. Douglas Lee is his name, and he's a smuggler. He doesn't usually smuggle humans, but because he's gotten into some situation with his bosses, he has to do this job. So he's got a bunch of Chinese undocumented workers in the belly of his tractor trailer, and they're trying to move them from Mexico into America. So, and this is them heading up onto the border. It's 4 miles to the border checkpoint. Douglas is wired. He is both drunk and high. His temples are tingling. His eyes aren't blinking. Blink, motherfucker, blink. The stereo is turned up loud. Douglas turns it up even more. The speakers start to crack. It's still American rock and roll. Douglas shakes his head and slaps his face to clear his thoughts. To get ready to perform for the border agents. A song comes on that Douglas knows. He sings along. He gets the words wrong. He's surprisingly self-conscious. Chucho seems to know the correct words, but he doesn't make a big deal out of it, and Douglas appreciates this. Douglas takes out a travel-sized mouthwash and takes a swig of it. He passes it to Chucho, who does the same. Both men swish the mouthwash around and then gargle. Douglas spits his out the window. Chucho follows suit. Douglas then fishes the empty cocaine vial out of his pocket and tosses it out the window as well. He does the same with the beer cans, one after another. As they go, some of them catch the wind and whap against the side of the cargo container. The song they were singing along to ends. Douglas sees something from his side mirror. Headlights. The headlights are closing in on them. Fuck is that? Chucho turns his head to look out the rearview mirror, and Douglas sticks his head out the window a little bit to turn and look back. A bright spotlight turns on and shines into his eyes. Chucho says, "Federales." A federal police pickup truck is behind them. It flashes its light bar, red and blue and white. The brightness cuts through the dark. Douglas squints and bangs a fist on the dashboard. "It's fine," says Chucho. "Stay cool, boss." Chucho points to the cargo and makes a shush gesture, and Douglas quiets down. He listens. The noise has stopped. Behind them, the police instruct them in Spanish and then English to pull over. Chucho downshifts the tractor-trailer, going backwards through the gears. They slow and come to a stop on the dirt shoulder. Then the police pickup pulls in front of them. Chucho says, "I'll deal with this." Douglas holds his hand out to Chucho, hands him a small roll of $100 bills. Chucho looks disappointed, but Douglas doesn't give him any more. Chucho puts the money in his pocket just as one officer comes to his window. Another officer stands underneath Douglas's window. This one is holding a shotgun. In Spanish, the first officer says, "What's in the cargo?" Chucho says, "Tomatoes." "Tomatoes, really? That's an extravagant transport for tomatoes. They're special, artisanal." "What?" "Special," says Chucho. "They are special tomatoes." The officer, with the shotgun, starts to walk over to the cargo container. He taps the shotgun against the container wall. That second officer says, "Jefe, there's something strange about this cargo." The officer with the shotgun waits for a response. And Douglas smiles at him and tries to act as if he's slightly bored by the process. He eyes the container through his mirror. He listens. The hum of the machinery rumbles on. But the workers stay quiet. It's soundproof, he tells himself. It's soundproof, but Douglas hears something, he thinks. He hears something. A voice. A knock. A breath. Breathing. Breathing. And then nothing. Douglas reaches behind his back, feeling the handle of his revolver. He feels a coldness. The coldness starts in his arms and moves into his middle. Douglas has only rarely fired his gun and never at a living thing. Chucho puts a hand on Douglas's elbow. Douglas looks at Chucho, and Chucho shakes his head. The officer under Chucho's window says, "You think we need to see your tomatoes?" This is an invitation for a bribe. Chucho says, "You're welcome to, but why waste time?" The officer says, "True. It's been a long night, and my partner has been itching to get home to his new wife." Chucho laughs, and the officer under Chucho's window laughs. The officer with the shotgun underneath Douglas's window does not laugh. It's not clear if he hasn't heard the conversation, or if he disapproves of them joking about his wife. The officer under Chucho's window gestures for him to get out of the cabin. Chucho opens his door. It swings heavy and then clicks open. He steps out. Douglas waits. The officer with the shotgun keeps a flashlight pointed at Douglas. Douglas tries not to let this annoy him, but it is annoying. He squints and tries to look the officer in the face. He knows this is dumb. The officer isn't going to want to be seen by Douglas, to be recognizable by him. But Douglas is drawn to the illumination. The other man's face framed by the police truck's spotlights, like a halo. I don't know this man, thinks Douglas. He could kill me, and he could help me. and I don't know him, and I never will.
Wow. That's probably the most upsetting story in the collection to me. Like the brutality. There's a brutality to the lived experience of the protagonist that I actually was happy to see on the page, because you see these stories of human smuggling, in the news, and some of them can be pretty horrific.
Yeah.
And it seems like the kind of thing that should be told. These stories, like the human aspect of these stories, like who are these people in these transport trucks trying to get across the border? And I think there was, something in either Texas or Mexico, somewhere near the border, not too long ago, where they found this truck, right?
Yeah, it's in Texas.
Did you see the story?
Yep.
And there were like, I don't know how many bodies in it, but it was just horrific.
Yeah.
Can you just talk about maybe the origin story for this one? Like, was there another story you had read, or was there something you had seen in the news that sparked it, or?
I mean, it did start with the story of undocumented immigrants being smuggled in a tomato truck. Like that was an actual news story, maybe 10 years ago. It was stuck in my head. Like, damn, these are human beings being shipped, as if they're like cargo or product, and that was really the start of it. Tried to imagine, like, who would be involved in a situation like this. How would that? I didn't really have like any personal experience knowing how this kind of stuff happens, but trying to look into like, well, who does this kind of stuff? How do people get involved in this sort of I guess work or industry, which is treated as?
Well, I always think, like, when I hear stories like this in the news, or you hear about these coyotes who are bringing people across the border on foot, like walking like however many miles through the desert, just like barely surviving, like kind of crawling across the desert to get here.
Yeah.
And then you hear about people who are upset about people coming over the border. I'm always thinking to myself, well, listen, if anybody's this desperate, if they're willing to pack themselves into a truck or walk across the desert at the risk of their own life, like, maybe we should pay attention to the fact that they're this desperate. Like,
right.
Where is our humanity? I guess it bothers me that the dehumanization of it,
And it's like kind of like what we were touching on earlier. It's like how quickly we forget that we're not that far removed from our own ancestors surviving stuff like this to get here and to make a life for themselves.
We live on stolen land.
Yeah, we all do. Yep, we all live on stolen land. We're all complicit in that. And and also, like, our ancestors went through hell to have that opportunity to plunder, I guess. But it's just like the short memories. I'm not sure if it's a short memory or just as like, well, hey, like, we got ours, and then we don't want anybody else to get theirs next. I'm not sure what that is, but as a nation of almost entirely of immigrants, it's like hard to imagine like well, we celebrate what our ancestors went through to get here, but we don't want to let other people have that same experience or that opportunity. It's a little sad.
That's like that to me. That's like, close to as shitty as you can get as a human being.
It's pretty shitty
to be that. Yeah, to be that blind to that just basic reality, and then to just get yours, and then just want to like elbow other people in the face who are trying to, just trying to survive, basically. And, it's making me think too, like thinking about my own particular immigration history in my family. We all have this, and I think sometimes about like my work ethic and just like this innate sense of fear that I have around survival and sustenance. I think maybe it's just a human thing, but I can sometimes theorize to myself that maybe it's like how far removed you are from the apocalypse generation, if we can call it that. Like, you're a first generation American. I imagine you had like a pretty visceral sense of like survival mode going on around you as your parents tried to assimilate and get a footing in this country. I could even sense it. Like, my dad was like up like 5 a.m. and like on his way to the office at 6:30, you know, just crazy my whole life, you know, and that's the way that I've sort of characterized it to myself, like, oh, this is some kind of inherited thing, you know, that gets passed down. And maybe if I'm going to extend this theory further, like if you're like, you know, you live in like Connecticut or something, and you can trace your ancestry all the way back to like this, you know, 1500s or something, maybe you're a lot more relaxed. You know, like maybe there's more of a sense of like, oh, of course I belong here. You know, my parents came over, or my great grandfather came over on the Mayflower or some shit like that. You know what I'm saying? I do
know what you're saying. I think there is this, this real, like you said, visceral insecurity that comes with being a first or even second generation immigrant. And then for the kids of the immigrants, it's a different experience too, where like if you immigrate as an adult, you've already had a lifetime of at least cultural security behind you, you know, like language security, racial security behind you. So you come into a new situation and you're a fully formed adult facing that new situation. But when you're born into it or come into it as a really young person, and it's like, well, you don't have that foundation to confront this stuff with. So you're like, you're just, I guess, like inside and out, marginalized. So I think that's something that I thought about a lot as a kid, and it comes out, I think it comes out a lot in my stories. I do notice like it does change. Like my kids are second generation Americans now, and you know, they have their own insecurities about life for sure, just like anybody, but they don't have that racial cultural insecurity that I just don't think they even understand it when we talk about it. Like they're worried about things socially too, but not, it's hard to put exact words onto, but I think that's like, there's something in there that I've been trying to get at. And maybe that's why it shows up so much in my stories. That feeling.
You know, I'm thinking back to, I had a conversation with an Asian American author named Abigail Wynn Rosewood earlier this year. And she, interestingly enough, was moving back. She's a Vietnamese American, and she's moving back to Vietnam. She was in the process, which I could understand. I remember talking to her, and like she was kind of telling me about, you know, the cost of living and how beautiful it was there. And I was like, maybe I should go. You know, like, especially, I will do that anytime anyone's moving somewhere. I'm like, maybe that's the place. You know? But I think in particular in the wake of the last 5 to 7 years, you know, as crazy as things have gotten in this country in so many respects, like I'm wondering, as somebody who's a first generation immigrant, has it ever occurred to you? Have you ever thought like maybe I should go back, or maybe? Like, do you feel like like rooted here enough, or are you like, you know what, this place is going to shit. Like maybe it would be better back in Taiwan.
Yeah, I've definitely thought about that a lot, for sure. And my wife and I have talked about it a lot. She's Korean, so we've talked about moving to South Korea, moving to Taiwan. I think the one, we would never do it. It's just for fun, but it's just
right.
Yeah, but it is very enticing. I think there's a big language barrier because I barely speak Mandarin, so it would take, and my kids don't speak Mandarin at all. My wife doesn't either.
Okay, but this is part of the immigration experience as well, like the encouragement in the assimilation process to sort of abandon your native tongue and to embrace English. This is what happened to my family. My dad was not allowed to learn Italian. It was like, no, don't speak Italian. You know, like don't speak Italian. You speak English. Like you're trying to, you know, to get integrated. They'll discriminate against you if you speak Italian, basically.
Right.
And for me, in my generation, I'm like, fuck, I would have loved to have known Italian. You know, like it would have been so great.
Right.
But, you know, I guess like they're trying to do what's best in the times that they're in.
They are. But then there's not really I mean, I guess there is probably some calculation about what will be lost, but you want to, in those situations, you want to lean towards the immediate survival, right? So, like you lose something long term that might be valuable, but the immediate survival is the important thing. So whatever that is, it's like if it's speaking English only, then that's going to help you today.
So in terms of like, let's talk about the immediate survival situation. You know, like you came over as a baby. Your parents brought you over here as a baby. and you lived most all of your life in Los Angeles. I think I read that you bounced around a little bit in those early, like, baby years.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were in Virginia at first. So that's where my brother was born in Virginia, Williamsburg, and then after my birth father passed away when we were really young. So my mom and my brother at that point, interestingly, did go back to Taiwan. So he went to Taiwan, lived with my grandparents for a while, and my mom.
Wait, how old was he?
He was just a baby, like an infant, probably not like maybe just about 1 year old, 12 months old.
Oh, wow. What happened? And may I ask what happened to your dad?
He had passed away, and it's really it's a hard question to answer because we don't have specific, like, clear answers to what happened. He died in an accident. That's the primary story we were told. In Ohio, he was working at the time in Ohio, so it's a little bit of a mystery. There's a little bit of a mystery, yeah. And I think that's maybe at the core of some of my storytelling too. It's like some things happen, and you don't always get to know like exactly what it was, but you feel the effects of it though. So
right.
Something devastating happens, and somebody might know the truth of it, but in any case, an entire, like, that was maybe a second apocalyptic moment that I think about a lot. Is like, so there's the apocalypse of losing or leaving your birth world, and then there's like family systems apocalypses where something happens within the family, somebody dies, somebody leaves, and nothing is the same afterwards. So that was like
you were a baby when this happened?
I was probably about 3. I think I was 3.
Okay. And it was a workplace accident?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe so.
And you just didn't. And nobody ever told you like what happened in a definitive way.
Yeah, I've heard different things about it, like that it was a car accident of some kind, but then at some point there was something going around that it was actually an illness. So, and we don't have the paperwork behind it to find out exactly what it was. So,
right, your poor mom.
Yeah, my mom had a really hard time, so she didn't know what to do. She just had these 2 babies, and she was alone. And I think she had she could have just stayed. We could have just stayed in Virginia. So, like, a lot of my dad's family, my father's family were there. They're still there. But I think my mom just didn't want to deal with anything and wanted a completely fresh start. So she packed up. But she also couldn't deal with having 2 kids, so I think she let my grandparents take my brother, and she and I moved to Seattle. So we lived in Seattle for a couple years, and then down to LA, and then she met my stepdad. My brother joined back up with us, and I've been here ever since, like almost 45 years probably.
Where in LA?
San Gabriel Valley. So I grew up in a city called Arcadia. I live out here now too. Still live out here.
Okay. Wow. That's quite a story. And it's really sad, I like to get over here. Like, it makes, I guess, like, hearing that makes the collection come into a little bit sharper focus. Some of the energy in it and some of the stories, come into a little bit sharper focus. But and then your brother came back to live with you. Like, what age was he at?
He was probably around 4 or 5. I'm not sure. So one of the things that sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I didn't know how long the gap was when he was in Taiwan and then he comes back, but it was just kind of getting situated. Once your mom got situated better, she brought him back over to the States.
Yeah, it was never intended to be a permanent thing.
And did you like growing up in Arcadia?
No, I did not like it at all. It was Arcadia. I mean, yeah, Arcadia is a really like nice town. It's it's like clean. The cops are very active, so it's but coming into Arcadia again, this was another sort of, it might inform something about my book as well. It's like coming into Arcadia. It was a white town at first. Like when we moved here in the early 80s, it was almost entirely white. but it was like on the precipice of becoming like a majority Asian American town. So that was when my family and I moved in here. We were one of the first Asian families in Arcadia that I knew of. Like when I first started school in Arcadia, it was first grade, and there was one other Asian kid, and he was a Japanese American kid, and we were like the two Asian kids in school. And by the time I graduated high school, I think it was about a third Asian American, and I believe now it's well over 50%, maybe even upwards, well, at least well over 50%, I'd say for sure. So that was a big transitional time for the city, and some people were cool with it and some people were not. So there was like, and that was, I think citywide, even outside of Arcadia, there were a lot of movements. There was during that time in the 80s, there was the English only movement. Were you in LA back then in the 80s?
No, I'm from the Midwest. I was in Milwaukee or Indiana. Yeah. So there was like this proposition that was going to outlaw like foreign languages, foreign non-English languages on like billboards and signage and stuff. So that was like that was like an overarching thing. So there's just a lot of animosity towards newcomers at the time. Dealt with it at school. Why do people get so worked up? Why do people get so worked up about people speaking in a different language? I mean, it makes me crazy. These people who are like so offended by the fact that you would speak a different language or write in a different language. Like, talk about fragile.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it is to get someone to that point where they're actively like angry and trying to change laws or incite violence over it. I don't know. I mean, I can understand somebody being people get annoyed by things all the time, and that's human. Everybody gets annoyed by things. Maybe you don't like somebody talking and wondering if they're talking about you. I don't know. But yeah, the point of violence or like legal action seems really extreme.
Yeah.
So protectiveness,
relax a little bit.
I don't know. Yeah.
So at what age do you think you started to think of yourself as a writer? Like, was this something you were interested in as a kid, or is it something you came to later?
Oh, I was always interested in writing. So I think as a kid, I loved like just putting together little stories. I was like we played like Dungeons and Dragons for a while. So I was the dungeon master, like making up stories for the other kids, my brother and our friends. As a kid, my favorite author, as for a lot of kids, was Stephen King. So I read everything Stephen King wrote, and I would literally like copy his stories, with just changing the protagonist to me, and just rewrite them, type them out on a typewriter or by hand, and just share them with my friends and stuff. I don't know if most of them probably didn't read it, but it's still fun to do. So yeah, I always loved writing and storytelling. That's just been something that's been a part of my life.
But you had, I think we're close to the same age. So there's a lot of space between like maybe graduating high school and getting to this collection. Can you talk a little bit about like the creative journey that you went on? Yeah.
I went into community college. I wanted to study creative writing. So I took my first workshop, and I think I was 17 years old. I know now I wasn't ready for critique and workshop. So that was really like ego crushing for me. I didn't know what to do with that because I was sharing stuff that was so personal, but yet trying to deal with criticism about it and how to work with that. So I stepped away from it because I didn't think I could. It wasn't that clear in my mind why at the time. I just knew I didn't like it. So I studied English literature instead, and then I went through a bunch of stuff. So I wanted to be a musician for a while. And then after that didn't work out, I wanted to work in the music business. And then after that didn't work out, I studied psychology and I became like a marriage and family therapist for a really long time. So I worked as a marriage and family therapist, in private practice and community mental health for probably 15 years, I guess.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's the stuff I did before, or in between.
I guess that does show up a little bit in the collection, like not in an explicit way, maybe, but you can feel like family dynamics being explored in a really like clear and knowing way. I have to imagine that I guess what I'm getting at is I have to imagine that line of work could be good fodder for fiction, or in a way good training for writing, because it forces you to like come into close contact with the intimacies of other people and their relationship dynamics.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a couple of things I got from that line of work were, one, like a very close observation of people. 'Cause I think that's like, for me anyway, the way I used to work, the majority of it was a very close and steady observation of my clients, like suspending judgment and just like really trying to understand, or not even understand, but just watch and listen to where they're at. I think that helps a lot as a fiction writer, coming into things, situations, imaginary situations, without like, I guess preset judgments or like ideas of where this is supposed to go, but following in a very natural kind of way. I've seen a few other things, like people are never always what they appear. I think that's something you learn in the therapy work, like how people present is the real them, but it's also not the complete them. So I think that's helped a lot too. And then I think in terms of like family systems, or any systems at all, one idea that always clicked with me was the idea that when you have a system, which in a family could be like the members of the family, if one person changes, then that affects everybody else. And so I always think about things that way, that in a system, when one part changes, the entire system is going to react to it in some way or another. And a lot of times it's going to react in a way to try to make up for that changed person, or to try to stop that change from happening. That's kind of the initial reaction. That's funny that we get to this, because it's like that's probably what's happening nationally. When something changes, there's that strong reaction to compel the status quo to come back, So maybe that's why people hate foreign languages, because when they see something new, there's some at least part of that system that wants to eliminate that new thing. And it seems like that's I don't know if it's universal, but it does seem to happen a lot.
Yeah, and it's funny to think about this sort of thing, and like changes in systems, changes in family systems, and the impact that they have on everybody, but in particular the impact that they have on kids, because that is something that you're exploring a lot in this book. That is, among the most moving aspects of it, because kids don't necessarily have the experience or the information yet, or the wherewithal to deal with a lot of the heavier stuff that can come at you in life, and to be caught up in changing systems, or to be caught up in these kinds of like darker dynamics of the human and family experience. It's interesting to sort of center those stories on the kids, because I don't know, I think for the reader, what it does is it forces you to kind of view the thing through their limited perspective, if that's a way of putting it. Do you know what I'm getting at? They have like, they don't have necessarily the power or the maturity yet to deal with it, and yet they must in some way deal with it, because they have no choice.
Yeah, that lack of choice is, I think, really important to me anyway, like how these stories or how life unfolds for young people. It's like, it's a very real and painful thing to deal with for any of us, but it's also like a very interesting thing to investigate in stories. Like what happens when somebody's put in somebody who is very vulnerable is compelled to act in their own self-interest, or for their own survival, in a situation that they're not equipped to deal with. I think that's always going to be something interesting to read or to watch and to write.
Well, I think about your personal history, the loss of your father when you were so young. Like, your family was already in a destabilized situation, as, like you say, like the apocalypse of immigration. And then to have this loss in the family system that was so heavy and catastrophic. What's interesting to me is to think about you at 3, where you don't necessarily have full awareness of what's going on, but you do feel the loss. And I'm interested as a parent, in the ways in which traumas impact kids. Stuff that's happened in my family relative to my son's health. Like, how is that impacting my daughter? I think about that.
Yeah.
Because as much as I want to believe that my wife and I have sort of put on a brave face and have kept things steady, you're never perfect. I'm sure your mom tried to do the same for you. But do you ever think about that? Like, because you were so young, you know what I'm saying? Like, how did that imprint itself on me? And it had to have. If you feel it in these stories, now that I know this about you, it's like, oh, yeah, that's somewhere in there, right? But probably in ways that you can't even fully define, I would imagine.
There's a lot to that because, it happening so young, things that happen when you're in some ways like pre-verbal, it is a lot harder to put language to it because it's much more like a sensory, or I guess emotional or relational kind of impact on you. So I don't know. I don't really have answers to that kind of stuff. It is like those things are my obsessions as a writer. So that's why it comes out in my book. It probably will come out in everything I write in the foreseeable future. And it's one of the things I do wonder about, though. And I think I look at it in the last story in the collection. There are no more secrets on planet Earth. It's the idea that like there was, and there probably still is, some ideology around like keeping secrets as a way to protect children. So that's like, it definitely was something in my family. I don't want to overgeneralize the cultures, but I'm sure every culture has some population within it that believes that. And I don't think that helps kids actually in the end, like keeping secrets. Because the thing is, like for me, for sure, I still felt all the damage of whatever happened. Everything that happened, it's still a part of me. It's ingrained into my body. I feel, I can feel it. I mean, even saying in my mind is not enough. Like you feel it throughout your whole visceral system, right? And not having like somebody who's mature and responsible, like kind of walk you through it, kind of give you words for it, it give you like some space to work out like what was my part in it. Maybe that's something that kids, at least this is what we had learned back when I was in psychology grad school. I don't know if this is still a mainstream idea now, but that a lot of kids take responsibility for bad things that happen, which doesn't actually make any sense at all logically. So there's a lot of theories why kids did this or do this, but it seemed to be something that happened a lot, that when somebody died in a family, the kid would think they were responsible for it. And if there's not anybody there to tell you, no, that wasn't your fault, that might just be a lingering feeling you always have. And when you get older, you might even have the logic to, like counteract that, but the emotional part of it still kind of sits around and like, bites at you or gets you in your darker moments. So that
I don't
openness.
I don't think it's good. I mean, I completely understand the instinct to want to protect a child from the darker things. Like, oh, we don't need to talk about this. The kid's 4. But it doesn't, I don't think it ever ends well. As difficult as it is. I mean, I think you do have to maybe curate the experience for a young child and use particular language that they can make sense of. You can't just lay it like some super heavy thing on them in the way that you would somebody who's like 35,
Yeah,
obviously.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But keeping it secret and having the weight of that secret sort of intuitively felt, I'm not entirely sure what damage that does. You would probably know more about this with your psychology background than I would, but I've seen it play out before, and I've seen like it's usually the after effects. I'm not seeing it necessarily play out in real time, but I'm talking to people who had some big family secret, and they never talk about it fondly.
Yeah,
it's never like, oh, thank God they didn't tell me, what actually happened to mom or whatever. It's like they'd be better off knowing, even if it is a heavy truth. At least they have the truth. You see this sometimes in adoption scenarios too, where parents don't tell their child that the child is adopted, and it's like, holy cow! Like, I don't think I think it's just they're better off knowing from the jump than having it, sprung on them when they're 18 years old or something.
Totally, or finding out accidentally somehow in their adulthood. But that does make sense, though, that there's a reason why people keep these secrets and don't come clean. It's really hard to do. Like, it just is a hard thing to do. Like the mitigating part, right? Well, how much do you tell a young child? What will be overwhelming for them, and what will be appropriate for them? And then there's the hard part of am I emotionally mature enough to guide my kid through this thing that I myself barely have a handle on? So I get why parents do it. But at the same time, it doesn't work out well in the end. It's sort of, there's no easy answer to it, but I do think if it can be done, man, that would be so much better. I would have liked it personally.
I feel like, I'm the same way. And I think temperamentally, maybe writers and psychologists, people whose line of work has them on a regular basis confronting their interiors and confronting the hidden aspects of the human experience that don't, that's the job, right? Is to kind of investigate these things that are often buried or concealed in some way or difficult. Maybe we would be predisposed to overcorrect and be too honest with our kids. I can sometimes worry about that with me. I'll say something to my daughter and I'll be like, well, maybe that was too much. She's 11. Right?
Definitely. That could definitely happen. Yeah. I think early on I told my kids, hey guys, I'll never lie to you. But then I'm like, dang, maybe there's some things they could have you could have softened a little. Yeah, I could have softened or I could have covered up for a little while. Yeah.
Right. No, I mean, I remember having conversations with my daughter about death when she was little. And I was like, maybe too much hubris. I was like, I'm just going to be honest with her about not fully knowing. And I'm going to use this Buddhist cloud analogy that I really like. And I just ended up scaring the shit out of her. She was 4 years old. And I just, you take your lumps as a parent, you try your best, and then sometimes you screw it up.
It's you always screw it up. No matter which direction you go, there's always some version of either you're too honest or you're too secretive. Whichever way you go, you always screw it up.
Yeah, and there's the hubris of this corrective attitude that people have, especially when they're parents to young children. So it's okay, now I get to do everything the way that I want to do it, that I wish it would have been done for me, all this, and then you still fuck it up. Do you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
That's I think the most humbling part of it is maybe you make some sort of marked marginal improvement. My friend Mira, her mom years ago said something funny where she was every generation, the best you can do is improve 3% on whatever generation preceded you. That's the best case scenario. Hopefully you don't regress and fuck it up and make it worse.
Right.
But if you have some sort of, grand vision of being the perfect parent or, raising your kids just right, good luck. You're gonna wind up humbled, I think.
I totally agree. And I love that 3% estimate of how much improvement you can hope for. I kind of think it is just about that much, no matter what.
We just nudge it forward. We nudge it forward, hopefully. That's evolution or something.
Exactly.
But I think you're going to, I think where I've come to is that what I do is way more important than what I say. I don't say as much. You would think for somebody who does a talk show, and you know what? Maybe my kids would refute this and be like, he won't shut up. I really try not to. I try not to pontificate too much or to weigh in and micromanage stuff. I think if I'm just behaving in a certain way, calm and you know what I'm getting at, well adjusted. That has as much impact as anything. That what I'm blabbering at them, they're going to forget a lot of it or just ignore it.
I feel like absolutely are. I think you're exactly right I agree with that. I don't know if I'd try actively to take that route, but I think that's going to be all the impact, that thoughtfulness doing things non-reactively, I think really helps a lot. And you can't really tell kids, hey, don't be reactive. Like, how's that? I don't know how that's going to like sink into them. But if they see you not being reactive, then okay, that gives them some sense. Oh yeah, there's a way to respond to things. Even if you're feeling a certain way, you don't have to like act on that impulse immediately. You can be thoughtful about it. You can wonder about it, and you can act in a measured way.
Well, you talk about family systems and how they react, how reactive all the parts of a family system become to a change in one part of the family system. So, in a dramatic example, it would be like a loss. Somebody in the family dies and everybody's reacting to that loss and adjusting and everything. But in a more everyday sense, dad gets really pissed off in the presence of the family.
Yeah.
It could be something stupid. He could stub his toe, or
right.
Someone spills someone breaks a glass or spills orange juice all over the place, or whatever it is. How you respond to those sorts of things can have a big impact. I thought moods are contagious is basically the point.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
If I'm failing as a dad and I'm like raising my voice or being impatient, I've noticed how it spreads. Suddenly my kids are yelling.
Yep. Yeah. They're yelling or they're scared. I think it's like, I'm like all parents, I've been really imperfect too. And so I've had those moments where something stupid has happened and I've just reacted in rage in that moment. And it's like, it may not even have that much to do with the kids, but it's like something. Maybe it's like the evolutionary part that you have to react more strongly to negative or scary things. Like that stuff sticks with them for a long time. Like there could be like dozens of good experiences, that will still be outweighed by that one really scary moment. So it's,
right. Yeah. That's a fun guilt to carry around.
It's, yeah, right? Exactly. but it definitely is something. It is a fun guilt to carry around. But it's also, I don't know, it's part of another thing to just keep working forward on. Like, hey, yeah, that thing happened, And so.
Well, listen, as a marriage and family therapist, you should have this pretty nailed down. You probably run your ship perfectly, right?
You would think, yeah. My wife's a teacher too, so it's sort of like either the optimal setup or like the nightmare setup for kids.
Right. Yeah, we all do the best we can, hopefully. But I am wondering, before I let you go, if you are working on. Do you have a novel that you're now cooking up, or are you working on more stories? Is there something else in the works?
I am working on a novel now, and I've gotten through the first draft of it, which I've done before, but I feel I've gotten through a first draft that I like, so that's new for me. It's an Asian American Western set in the 1860s. It's like a Chinese Union soldier and his white brother. So they're the same mom, different fathers, and they're on a caper. So that's about as much as I can.
May I ask, is there a historical, like a actual historical foundation for the story?
For not precisely. There were some Chinese Americans that fought in the Civil War on both sides, but not at the level that this guy is. So no, it's not based on an actual person.
Did you have to do a lot of research?
Yeah, for sure. Like tons. I'm still doing it, like everything. The history part is a huge part of it, but even like learning horses, because it's like, I don't know anything about horses. I grew up in Arcadia, which at the time was very much the Santa Anita horse track driven economy. But a lot of my friends, their parents were in the horse business, but I was allergic to hay, so I didn't have much first-hand experience with it. But so I'm learning, So and I have to learn about like guns and stuff, like all the weaponry of the time,
muskets,
yeah. And
there's something funny. There's something absurd when you watch these old movies, like Civil War movies. Or Revolutionary War movies, the absurdity of watching people deal with muskets.
Right. Yeah.
And also just like how horrific to be like, you're lined up basically like 50 feet apart and you're sitting there trying to, I don't think that's something I would have been good at, under pressure, is dealing with it. I'm not good with machines, that would have driven me crazy.
Sadly, everybody was bad at that, but it's really interesting to see like how this drove the the trajectory of weaponry. Like we went from muskets to like machine guns in the course of the Civil War. Like the Gatling gun was developed at the time, so something that you can just crank out like hundreds of bullets at a time. It's a little bit scary how the ingenuity of man can be put on something so devastating.
Well, yeah, we're having this conversation on November 11th, which is Armistice Day, and Kurt Vonnegut's 100th birthday. That was a big thing for him.
Happy birthday, Kurt.
Just like the invention of the Gatling gun, the invention of, industrial warfare machines, the nuclear bomb, all this stuff. It's like, maybe our best brains should focus on things that have saner outcomes. Wouldn't that be nice?
That would be nice.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited for the Western, and wish you well on it. It's been really fun to talk to you and to meet you, and I'm glad that we got to shine a light on If I Were the Ocean, I'd Carry You Home, this great story collection of yours. So congratulations on it. I hope you enjoy, this moment and, the publication success.
Hey, thanks so much, Brad. Appreciate it. This was really fun.